for the talk tonight is about the difference of where we're at from where we say maybe a nuclear arms race was decades ago to where we are with the AI arms race. This is no longer a scenario that's reserved to just a few superpowers. It has capabilities that are being built in people's basements, in small companies, large companies, and in governments. And this has become pervasive everywhere we look, inside of our country and inside of the world.
Lieutenant Colonel Kenney has not only a military career, and obviously he is currently a National Security Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, which is quite an accomplishment in and of itself, but he has, in addition to his military career, served as a, let's see, what is the title? The Director of AI and Digital Transformation at Google. And also a special government employee as a member of the Defense Science Board, which an affiliate at the Laboratory for Information and Information and Decision Systems at MIT. He's also started a number of tech startups. He has sold a number of companies. He has been on the boards of many of them. He has invented things, it sounds like, in this area too, or at least brought them to market. So he is, I think, the embodiment of, the symbiosis between the military and industry and what it means to be, a sort of a polymath in this world. So I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. For my own part, having retired from the practice of law, I am now teaching at Suffolk Law School a course right now on emerging AI regulatory frameworks, which is a joy because it keeps changing. In the United States, we've just lost the only executive order that we had in this area. The EU has taken the lead on this. Some say that they are falling behind because they have an EU governance system in place. So it is going to be very interesting, I think, to hear, because the answer is always China when you talk about self-regulation and constraint. We remember that Elon Musk was one of the signatories to a famous letter which cautioned restraint and governance before, further advanced AI was deployed post the announcement of ChatGPT. That, of course, has fallen by the wayside, and we now have AI being used to determine whether government workers should stay in their jobs based on an email as to what they did over the last 5 days. So I think with all of the things that are happening in this field, both in the military and outside of the military, dual use, et cetera, categories, I think we have, just such a wealth of information or questions around the information explosion that is going on in terms of the use of data, how people are using our data, what it's going to mean for worker displacement, the environment, et cetera. And the one thing that I will say is that no law that I am aware of, including the EU's, governs the use of AI for military or national security reasons or uses. So basically that is a wide open area. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to Lieutenant Colonel Kenney. Thank you.
Excellent. So that was a fun introduction. And the thing about the introduction that I liked about it was I get really, really excited about new technologies. That's part of the challenge. My wife can tell you I can't sit still. Whether it's singing in the symphony or starting a company or deploying to Afghanistan or going in and out of government, I love doing things that are interesting and creative. And that, for me, is one of the reasons why AI was such a draw. I've been 26 years in the Army Reserve. I did some fun things as a Civil Affairs officer, but I also did some other things, setting up the AI Innovation Center for the Army Reserve down in Texas, helping get some traction by bringing in folks from outside the national security complex into the national security complex. There's so much happening so quickly that no one in the US government or the military can really keep up with everything that's happening without engaging, not just with the civilian sector, but engaging globally for what we see happening today. And that'll be a little bit of a recurring theme for the talk tonight, is about the difference of where we're at from where we say maybe a nuclear arms race was decades ago to where we are with the AI arms race. This is no longer a scenario that's reserved to just a few superpowers. It has capabilities that are being built in people's basements, in small companies, large companies, and in governments. And this has become pervasive everywhere we look inside of our country and inside of the world. So as we think about national security, one of the things that I feel very strongly about is this is a national security imperative. This is a technology that is already proven to be a very effective and very valuable tool as a negative tool in the landscape of global operations, whether it's with a company that's trying to protect its networks and its information, or governments that are trying to protect its networks and its information. There is a lot shared with a lot of risk that goes along with the huge amount of opportunity that's there. But a couple of things I think are really interesting to think about as we talk about it as a national security imperative. The first is AI truly is a force multiplier. If we think about the types of ways that we're using AI today in very, very simple ways, we can really start to see the value that we'll get from a government use of this technology. Something as simple as Grammarly. Grammarly is a fantastic tool to help tell me where all my double negatives are or where I'm using past tense when I shouldn't. It's fantastic. It saves me hours of time. If I try to think about research projects that I want to work on, my ability to use either ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude to help me think about what might I want to do from a research perspective accelerates my ability. If I then transition this into the military sense, when we look at the size of these organizations, the United States Army, for example, hundreds of thousands of people, it has hundreds of databases, hundreds of data sources. Thinking about AI from a large language perspective or a generative AI perspective, imagine how much more quickly we can gain insight from the massive amount of information that we have just by using simple tools. And we're talking, even in the most simple terms, about non-kinetic ways to use AI. When I say kinetic, I'm basically saying a weapon. A kinetic weapon takes a life, takes out a building, directs an activity towards defeating an enemy. Whereas a non-kinetic side is everything else. It's driving the MREs to the soldiers. It's fueling a ship in the middle of the ocean. All of that non-kinetic activity has tremendous benefits when you talk about applying AI to it. The other side of this too is that not only is it a force multiplier, but it's global. The way that we're looking at an advantage for a group today, whether it's a defense group or a commercial company, this is no longer reserved to who has billions of dollars. Yes, it may have taken billions of dollars to get us to where we are today, but the future capabilities of AI, in particular with national security, will not take the billions of dollars to make those next iterative steps of where we're going. And in thinking of this as a global aspect, the US's national security, in my personal opinion, cannot succeed nearly as well if it's not aligned with our allies. This is not an insular way to look at artificial intelligence from a national security perspective. As we look at our allies and we look at all of the operations that we do around the world as a civilian government or as a military, the ability to interface with our partners is huge. And as we think about the applications of artificial intelligence, we need to be thinking about how these things can be interoperable, protecting our data, protecting what we need to keep safe and secure in America, but also ensuring that we have the ability to communicate quickly and efficiently across our allies' borders. And then finally, the reason why this is so important from an ally perspective is because AI is increasing the risk. The escalations of risk, especially with things like misinformation and disinformation campaigns, are massive. I'll give you an example of where I first saw the real scare I had about large language models. I was down at Special Operations Command. This was in 2021. And I decided to do a hackathon. And I did a hackathon with something called GPT-Neo. Now, ChatGPT had just come out with 3.0. They were about to release 3.5. GPT-Neo was an open sourced similar tool to ChatGPT. And I thought, what the heck? We're going to throw 5 Army people in a room who are not technologists, and we're going to give them the tools, we'll give them a little bit of guidance, and I want to see what they can do to build a tool that could fool someone into thinking somebody said something. Pretty simple concept. 2 weeks later, these non-technical people had built their own chatbot that was specifically designed to always answer a prompt with misinformation in it. It took 2 weeks for non-technical people to do that in 2021, when things were a little bit more expensive and a little bit harder to use. And you fast forward just 4 years, less than 4 years, that was April of 2021, and that now might take 2 days for someone to do. There are tools today you can use online that you can simply put in a prompt and it will build an entire website for you. It'll build an entire software package for you. And the important thing about this to recognize from an escalation of risk is that we can use these tools for just as many nefarious reasons as we can use them for reasons to do good in the world. So where does the strategic investment need to come from? Well, first, it's in basic research. We've got a lot of companies that are developing these capabilities, but the national security complex needs to more aggressively embrace these technologies and do the basic research to understand where are the risks. How can I deploy these technologies? Where can they be best used? That level of basic research inside of the national security complex is absolutely essential for where we need to go as a country. The infrastructure is the foundation of all of this too. One of the things that folks have a tendency to think about is if you're going to do something with a large language model or you're going to build something really big, you need billions of dollars in massive data centers. You know, Elon Musk announced his XAI for Grok, his large language model, was going to cost $100 billion of all the technology that he was going to need. Companies are absolutely hammering NVIDIA to build more technology because NVIDIA is the biggest producer of hardware for the AI world today. They design the chips, they fab them, Taiwan builds them, they sell them, and folks are using them across the country. But the infrastructure does not need to be hardware in the national security complex. It actually can be software. Use the tools that already exist. Leverage the infrastructure that we have. You know, a little bit of a plug for the cloud computing side of these things is that we risk being able to defeat the risks if we're not willing to take risks. The US government, especially the Department of Defense, is pretty risk averse. They don't want to take a chance on something that can leak a national security secret, that can result in the loss of life, that can result in the loss of property. And there are many valid reasons why thinking about being risk averse are a good thing inside of the Department of Defense until, you know, you do something like I do and you go over to Afghanistan in the middle of a firefight, then risk balance is a little bit different than when I'm back here talking about AI. But that risk needs to happen in the infrastructure level and at the basic research level. So that gets us to the point where, well, who do we need to actually do this? The workforce of AI development. We can talk about reskilling and upskilling. We can talk about nearshoring, reshoring, onshoring. But at the end of the day, we need to be thinking 2 or 3 steps beyond where we are. And I'll give you an example of why I think this is so important. In the Defense Science Board, we talk a lot about workforce for the Department of Defense. And one of the things that I was very, very passionate about was I don't believe the US military necessarily needs to hire 100,000 AI engineers for workforce development. And the reason for me was the majority of the tools that you're going to use are not going to be software engineering tools. They're going to be end user tools. We need to think about workforce development for that acquisition person who's looking through hundreds of pages of documentation and how they can leverage AI with better prompts, with better responses, to be able to do their jobs better. Those are the big workforce changes that we need. And we need some of that research and we need some of that infrastructure to be able to do that. And then finally, the public-private partnerships. The Department of Defense is not going to build a foundational large language model. They're going to use foundational large language models that already exist, the ChatGPTs, the Geminis, the Claudes, that already exist. So as we think about these public-private partnerships, there's a lot that these companies are doing. An example is Google has thought about zero trust for a very long time. And the concept of zero trust doesn't necessarily align with how the Department of Defense has been thinking about network security. The Department of Defense thinks about network security mostly as a perimeter. I'm going to have a perimeter. I'm going to lock my perimeter down, and you can't get in. But if you do get in, it must mean that you're allowed to be in, and I'm going to let you do what you need to do. In the zero trust world, why this is so important from an AI perspective is because you may get into the perimeter, but then if you want to access a resource, I'm going to ask you again to validate that you need access to that resource. And then you may get some data out of that resource, but I'm going to validate you yet again about getting it. And this is not about entering a bunch of passwords all the time. It's about having these breadcrumbs and a trail of your access into systems. Because with AI, we'll talk a little bit about transparency and explainability later. That breadcrumb trail is going to become so important as we think about where we're going with AI. But how do we do this if we're thinking about it from an ethical perspective? There are a number of folks that will talk about responsible AI, ethical AI, explainable AI. And I'm going to try to pull that together a bit today under the umbrella of what is the ethical AI use and policy that we need to be thinking about. The first thing, as we think about ethics, is that responsible use, it has to be global. We can't have responsible use in the US and then go over to Germany and have them not have responsible use, and vice versa. Australia can't have a great responsible use policy and then try to work with the US and us not have one. We need to have reciprocity for the responsible use of these technologies so that we can compete on a global scale with our partners and with our allies. The second part of this is, if we think about bias and accountability, that affects trust. I was doing something yesterday at the Harvard Kennedy School that was hilarious. We were talking about robots, and there's a new robot called Cobalt that's a security robot. And if you're old enough to remember Doctor Who, there was an old robot called a Deflac. And it was like this tripod robot that would slide around the floor. Well, this thing looks just like it. And I thought, this is interesting. You know, as we talk about this, I was doing some guest lecturing with this class on emerging technology, and I asked ChatGPT, you know, show me what other ideas you would have about what a robot, a security robot, would look like. And I kid you not, the image that came back looked like a McDonald's cheeseburger with French fries on the side. I have no idea where that came from. No idea whatsoever. And that's what ChatGPT told me. And I've had some silly things with ChatGPT, but this was beyond the pale for me. And when we think about hallucinations, when they just make things up, how many of you heard about the young law associate in New York who submitted a brief to an appellate court? And the brief got through the clerk, and it got through the judge, and it got to the trial, and the defense compelled the plaintiffs to produce, where did this case law come from? That hallucination was so believable that it got through almost everyone until it got to the defense, because ChatGPT made it up. It made up case law. It had justified case law. That affects trust, massive effect of trust. And the bias is another aspect of this. If you've ever heard of Cathy O'Neil, she wrote a fantastic book that was called Weapons of Math Destruction. And it was an incredibly well-written book about how even in today's society, where we don't have AI as pervasive in some of the governments making decisions, that decisions are being made by systems that are biased against low income, against minorities, against certain occupations. And these are built into our system today for getting credit cards and getting mortgages and car insurance. Think about what happens with that data, which is already biased, now in the hands of artificial intelligence. So our awareness of that leans into why we need transparency and explainability as part of our ethical approach. You know, that transparency is absolutely important, but the explainability will be key. Now, I've had some very interesting debates over at the Belfer Center about what explainability really means. And there are those that believe explainability is a human telling you what that model did. I don't feel that that's the right direction for us to go. I feel much more strongly we need the models to explain to us the decisions that they made. And I use a story to kind of elicit why I think this is important. You know, we had Navy Special Warfare as part of Special Operations Command. SEALs are some of the most amazing men and women in the world. So the explainability of letting a human explain why something may have gone wrong or why they need more information is the same as sending a SEAL overseas to do a mission. They do the mission, something goes totally haywire. They come back from that mission, and the leaders don't ask that SEAL what happened. They tell the SEAL to go hang out in the hotel, and they fly to Coronado, California, and talk to the instructors at the SEAL school and say, why did you train the SEAL to do this that way? Because this mission went bad. That's the same type of corollary. If we ask the engineers all the time why a model made a decision, they are still assuming about why that decision was made. The models need to be able to provide that transparency. The models need to be able to provide the explainability. And then finally, thinking about the global nature and the global nature of risk, we need the international community to come together to find those norms that we can put together so that we can work collectively on all of these ethical principles with AI. So bridging that responsibility and that explainability is incredibly important. Explainability is going to foster trust. The more we can have these models not only give us answers to our prompts, but explain why they may have given an answer that wasn't quite right, develops trust. Just like with our girls, when we were raising our girls, it wasn't so much about the fact that you made a mistake, but tell me, what was your thought process that led you to make that mistake? And then we'll figure out how we can course correct. The other side of this is that the accountability for these AI systems is absolutely critical. You saw this early on in the battle between Gemini and ChatGPT, between Google's tool and OpenAI's tool. One of the very, very rapid advances shortly after that whole competition started was this technology called retrieval augmented generation. And what that meant was, as these models are looking for answers in a large language model, they're doing it in a way where they can look for data and sources to inform their answer and then provide that information. Much the same when you search on Google today, in the top bar where you can do AI searching, it will give you a link and it'll give you the sources that are there. That retrieval augmented generation was a huge step forward to generate that level of trust. And then as we think about allies and we think about trust and verification, we need to be able to do this at the speed of competition of the future. Having an oversight body with a bunch of humans who are trying to figure out all of the data that needs to be shared, whether it's shared securely, how it's being shared, is not going to scale. We need to apply artificial intelligence technologies to artificially intelligent technologies to be able to drive this forward faster. Humans are not going to be able to keep up with the pace that we're going to move. So where does this fit in for defense and for deterrence? There's really three categories in my mind. One is the AI arms race. We're moving very, very quickly and technologies are getting better. For those of you who saw the recent news, there were AI technologies that were used to essentially steal over $1 billion from a crypto wallet. And they did it by merging the human and the large language model teaming to be able to affect the chain of custody model of where the approvals were to move money from what's called a hot wallet, where they're using money for their everyday business, to a cold wallet where money is just stored for future use. They were able to manipulate this at a scale nobody has seen before from a theft perspective. That's huge. The second is countering adversarial AI. There's a really great group down in Tampa at Special Operations Command. It's called the Joint Military Information Support Operations Web Operations Center, the JMWIC. That is the actual name. And the thing about trying to help that team was they were dealing with misinformation and disinformation from around the world all day, every day. And the solution to simply have humans monitor social media, to monitor data feeds, is unscalable with how pervasive all of this is getting today. So while human oversight remains essential, we need to be able to have artificially intelligent agents handle some of this counter of the adversary. And then finally, balancing AI and human decision-making is absolutely critical. So going back to this discussion about kinetic and non-kinetic, there's a couple of ways that the Defense Department views the kinetic activity. One is human in the loop, means no decision to take a kinetic action is done without the human saying it should be done. A human on the loop is when a human is observing some of the decisions that are being made, but isn't necessarily pulling the trigger. And then the last is human out of the loop, where they're not in the loop at all, which is the one that terrifies most people. That's the Terminator scenario where, the bots have gone crazy and all of a sudden, we've got people coming from the future. So with AI misuse and operations, thinking about AI-driven misinformation is already happening. And it's happening also with AI-driven innovation. The president of India in the most recent election actually used some really cool generative AI tools to recreate speeches that he made. There's a tool called HeyGen, H-E-Y-G-E-N, out on the market today that does a fantastic job. I actually did a demonstration of it where I did a speech in English, and within 30 seconds, it did the speech in French and in German. And it had different inflections and different pitches. It was fantastic. So it can be used for good, but we're seeing this also being used for adversaries. Media literacy programs and then rapid response frameworks, all of these are critical for us to be able to identify when we have misinformation or disinformation issues and how we're going to address it. So the road ahead, the key decisions, from where I see the AI leadership needs to come from, are broken up into these 5 groups. We need national infrastructure for AI. We've got to rapidly identify how we're going to build out the underlying infrastructure to be able to deliver on the future. We have to balance innovation with regulation. This really comes into play with how are we going to find ways that we can be less risk averse so that we can move faster with some of these capabilities. And there are areas we can do this. It isn't just a blanket across the board. We must have global governance. And that doesn't mean that we need one governing body, but to me what that means is we need a global governance that says we want to work together to figure out the EU AI Act, along with what the president is putting out for executive orders, along with what's happening in India and Australia, across the allies landscape from a national security perspective. And we need to think about those strategies. They've got to contemplate the positive and the negative effect. We can't just worry about the adversaries. We also have to think about how this can improve everyday lives for Americans here, Americans abroad, and for our allies. And then finally, we really have to be serious about AI workforce readiness. That is essential. We are not going to be able to hire everyone brand new to be able to do this. We've got to find those ways that people can engage with artificial intelligence in meaningful ways that move this ball down the field. So finally, this really is about national power. AI is going to be tied to national power for the rest of our lifetimes, probably even for our children's lifetimes as we think about this. And it's a global challenge that we need to meet head on and not wait for it. There's a really great quote that I'll close this out with that I remember before, which is plan or be planned upon. This technology is moving so quickly, we in the national security complex in many sectors are being planned upon, and we need to change that. So I thank you again for the time. This is really great being here. Thank you to World Boston, obviously, or World Congress. I think we're going to open this up to Q&A.
That was a really terrific introduction. I think you should come to my class and teach it next week if you don't mind. Thank you. A question, though, that I have is, it sounds like the U.S. military national security complex is relying on the private sector more than we saw, for example, with the internet, where DARPA was the creator of the internet. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship, and you are sort of a living, breathing example of it, of the relationship between what the tech platforms, those who are involved in AI development in the private sector are doing with the military, because I guess, it just seems, though, that if we are just waiting for the private sector to give us co-pilot type tools, and obviously there are lots of things going on that you didn't get into the details of, you'd probably have to kill us in terms of,
I wouldn't be happy
robotics.
about it, though. I'd be very sad.
But I mean, I'm just trying to understand whether you think this is a different dynamic than we've seen in regard to prior developments or not. Or whether this is more of the same and this is fine and the symbiosis is working and it's just a matter of, sort of passing the ball from private sector back to government and so forth.
I'll say a couple of things about that I don't necessarily believe that the Department of Defense or the US government is relying on the private sector. There are still a lot of systems that are built inside of organizations like the Department of Defense that handle their own internet traffic. They have their own data centers. There's something called the DoDIN, which is the Department of Defense Information Network, that the majority of information travels across the department's network, especially when we talk about the secret or the top secret level for sending information. It is still a Department of Defense controlled environment. So I don't necessarily believe they're relying on private. What I do think makes a difference that's related to what you're talking about is that when you think about the advent of the internet, how many decades did it take between when DARPA invented it, teams started using it, folks started to see some value in it, and it took off and really became your first software as a service application that you were building in the late 90s or early 2000s. It was decades.
Well, AI started in the 40s.
No, well, yes, but the use of AI and the pragmatic use of AI has only really been around for maybe a decade. And even then, still used in relatively simple ways. And the reason why I think this is important is because when I think about AI, I don't think about things like the Turing machine, because I don't necessarily believe that's necessarily AI. I don't believe a lot of self-driving cars are AI. They're really, really good algorithms. The biggest question is a self-driving car that knows whether or not to avoid a dog in the street is one thing. You can program it to do that, and it doesn't necessarily need AI. But if you can have that car then learn, I've seen a dog, I was trained on a dog, I have now learned what a dog is. I'm going to see a different color or a different size or a different shape or in a different environment, and I'm going to know that's a dog then. And I didn't have to tell it that that was a dog. So the real concept of where we are, especially with large language models, the invention of the transformer was only in 2017. And the implementation of the transformer was only a few years ago at scale. So the difference for me is, yes, AI started in the 1940s. The internet started, you could argue, in 1912, when the first concept of, I want to send something automatically rather than a human tapping a Morse code. Those are the same types of lengths. But even when we got that internet into the market, it still took decades to really take hold. Now we're talking about things where we're getting updates in months or weeks that aren't there. That's where I think we need to tie in the government, not to rely on the private sector, but to embrace the private sector and how quickly they're moving to be able to achieve their missions as well.
Thank you so much. You talk about the AI race. And until recently, the sort of conventional wisdom we were hearing is the following, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a specialist, that basically in terms of AI, there are two countries that are seriously in the game, and that is the United States and China. And the second assertion was that the United States is so far ahead in terms of the private companies, the universities, research labs, and so on and so forth, that it really isn't a serious contest. Now, a few weeks ago, we know what happened with DeepSeek. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you can elaborate a bit, because the argument has also been made that China has this extraordinary amount of data, which they collect not just because of the size of population, but also because they have so many devices that they use, and people are much less, averse in China to sharing private data than they are in this country. So what does that bode for the future development of AI, which depends so heavily on data? That's my question.
I do believe the US is far ahead. I do. However, in business school, you learn about this concept of the second mover advantage. And if you think about what happened with DeepSeek recently, DeepSeek, their success that quickly, that cheap, was a second mover advantage. And so as we think about where China is and where they're going and what they're developing, they have a tremendous amount of opportunity. And that is a massive competitive risk for the United States for two reasons. One is because they're moving very, very quickly and they have a lot of funds to really put towards this, in addition to the data, they're attracting talent. Google just lost one of its premier AI VPs to ByteDance and is now the CTO of ByteDance in China. Massive, massive loss for a company like Google to lose a brilliant mind like that. But to your point about data, that's an exceptionally astute aspect of the challenge that we're going to foresee in the next, say, 5 to 6 years. In the United States, we have a lot of controls over privacy. Anytime the government wants to do something or do an experiment, there are regulations on things like US persons of interest and recording people and seeing their faces and hearing their voices. We have a lot of protections against collecting that information and using it for our own purposes that are built into our system of laws. And China doesn't have that. So to your point about data, when we think about what's most important in artificial intelligence, number one is data, but more important than that is good data. But the more good data you have, the better you can train your models. And that's going to be an area that we're going to have to watch very, very closely, because the same constraints on use of data don't exist in China as they do here in the US.
Okay, we have a big audience actually tonight on Zoom, so I want to take at least one. Out of the box question, how do you see AI shaping the ways we identify, develop, and mentor future military leaders? And how should AI be integrated into leadership and mentorship in the military?
That is a fascinating question, because we talked about this a lot at Special Operations Command. How can we do that? One of the soft tenets was you can't mass produce special operations forces. These are long training programs. These are grueling training programs. In the case of like special forces, it's a 2-year pipeline from the time you start to the time that you even go on your first mission. It's a massive amount of investment. So we talked a lot about the emotional, the social, the technical, the tactical. How do we apply this capability long term inside of the force? And I think there's a number of areas that we can look at. Number one is some of these large language models are getting very, very good at reasoning and helping reason just for figuring out where someone's motivation is. So if you think about how you're training out in the field, you're absolutely exhausted. You've had almost nothing to eat. You're literally up to the mud in Florida in the summer, just getting eaten alive. And you can't make a very clear decision. Certainly not as clear as you could if you were in Garrison in North Carolina, having a steak dinner. So how could we apply artificial intelligence to start seeing where the breaking points for some of these soldiers, sailors, and airmen might be before they actually get to the breaking point, right? Because sometimes you get to that breaking point and it's really hard to recover. But if you can get close to that breaking point, identify it, you still have some cognitive ability to reset and to continue on. So that's an area.
And so then sort of a follow-on to that is, or I guess associated with that, is how is AI already integrated into leadership training, not just into managing other people, but I'm a young leader in the military, and along with whatever else strategy, they're teaching me to use AI. In what way?
Do you mean AI that we're using to teach, or how we're teaching people how to use AI?
How to teach, that is how they will use AI in the same way that once upon a time they were using a compass and a sextant.
So it starts at the top, in my mind, because you need the senior leaders to understand the value. And so one of the things that we did, which was a lot of fun to do and was really valuable, is I worked with my friends over at MIT, and we developed an entire 6-week training program. And it was all about, this is what AI is. And it started from the point of AI relies on data. Data is spelled D-A-T-A. Data is very important to you. And it went all the way through, some high-level concepts of computer vision, of neural networks, natural language processing, touched a bit on large language models. So that's a big part of the start, because the generals and the admirals and the senior executives need to understand why this is important, while you are concurrently helping the lower ranks embrace what they naturally want to use. So you've got this leadership making sure they're informed, while you're helping the teams down here who are the digital natives use the tools that they want to use. And a really great example, we set up a whole infrastructure, going back to my AI infrastructure, for Special Operations Command, and we let anyone in Special Operations Command use it. And after about 6 months of this, we had about 1,200 people around SOCOM. We have about 75,000 people in SOCOM. We had about 1,300 of those people who were on this platform trying to do data science, trying to build large language models. And it was incredible to see that 50% of those were junior enlisted Marines. You would have thought, oh, the Air Force folks are going to do this first. Oh, no, the Navy folks, maybe the Army folks. Not a lot of people would have thought about the Marines. That was the biggest component of people that were using our infrastructure, because their leadership got it right away. And they opened the door for people to experiment and allowed the folks who know what the problems are to solve, because they're dealing with problems every day, to leverage AI to solve them. It was a fascinating experience.
Thank you for your thoughts, Lieutenant Colonel. Listening to what you talked about when you mentioned explainability, that's something that sort of stuck with me. I think about, national security can be influenced through the federal agencies, through the Department of Defense, but so much of it can impact individuals like us on a daily basis too. Most of us have at least one device through which we engage with AI, if not more, on a daily basis.
Okay.
When it comes to explainability, how do we sort of, address the challenge of scale, where every single person is engaging with AI without really knowing how to understand that,
right?
To what extent really, how do I engage with AI?
Great. And then we're going to get Ed's question right here. We're just going to popcorn that out, and off you go. Go ahead, Ed.
You made a point about that legal issue where it was total nonsense. What controls do you have that the AI in the end is only as good as the data that it uses? What controls are out to make sure that it is getting correct data? As they used to say, garbage in, garbage out.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And that's what they're too.
So and those two are very well linked between how are you validating your data and how the data is being used, and then explainability. There's a huge part of that. So in that instance, nobody was validating it at all. It was just a whole bunch of data from the internet. Somebody read a whole bunch of law books, somebody meaning a bot, read a whole bunch of law books and said, oh, this sounds right. Here's what I'm going to tell you actually sounds right. So in that particular instance, nobody was looking at the data that was going in to really say, how is this going to be used? And then more importantly, nobody was explaining what was the thought process, the chain of thought that was happening to come up with that discussion. Right? Because if you had stopgaps in that process, maybe the first one is, this is a legal question. The second is, this is US code. The third is, this is the state of New York. The fourth is, this is the city of New York. Here's what I think. If there was some explainability there, you'd immediately have a red flag that said, I cannot correlate my answer to what I just said was my answer. And that's one of those examples of explainability that can tie into what you're talking about. The second part of this that I think is important with explainability as it relates to the Department of Defense, I had an unnerving conversation with a very senior leader who was responsible for a part of technology in the Department of Defense. And this was about 1.5 years ago. And he said, look, I need large language models so that I can give the large language model to someone who's not an expert, and they can immediately become an expert. And that terrified me. It absolutely terrified me, because the number one challenge we have right now today is when you are not an expert and you can't even explain the prompt and you get the prompt, how in the world are you going to know whether or not that's a right answer? How many of you would go on to ChatGPT right now today with a child with 103-degree fever and ask ChatGPT, how much medicine should I give my child tonight? Not many. We still don't have that level of trust, because We don't have full explainability just yet, and we don't have full control over the inputs and the outputs. It's still a work in progress.
Still a work in progress. There we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Tom Kenney.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.